She is an artist. She is an artist. She is an engineer. She is an engineer. She is an architect. She is an architect. She is an actress. She is an actress. She is an author. She is an author. She is an investor. She is an investor. She is an organizer. She is an organizer. She is an inspector. She is an inspector. She is an operator. She is an operator. She is an explorer. She is an explorer. She isn't a pilot. She isn't a pilot. She isn't a firefighter. She isn't a firefighter. She isn't a scientist. She isn't a scientist. She isn't a musician. She isn't a musician. She isn't a painter. She isn't a painter. She isn't a mechanic. She isn't a mechanic. She isn't a director. She isn't a director. She isn't a nurse. She isn't a nurse. She isn't a teacher. She isn't a teacher. She isn't a writer. She isn't a writer. Is she a teacher? Is she a teacher? Is she a scientist? Is she a scientist? Is she an artist? Is she an artist? Is she a musician? Is she a musician? Is she a writer? Is she a writer? Is she a doctor? Is she a doctor? Is she a chef? Is she a chef? Is she a nurse? Is she a nurse? Is she a director? Is she a director? Is she a librarian? Is she a librarian? Isn't she a teacher? Isn't she a teacher? Isn't she a scientist? Isn't she a scientist? Isn't she an artist? Isn't she an artist? Isn't she a musician? Isn't she a musician? Isn't she a writer? Isn't she a writer? Isn't she a doctor? Isn't she a doctor? Isn't she a chef? Isn't she a chef? Isn't she a nurse? Isn't she a nurse? Isn't she a director? Isn't she a director? Isn't she a librarian? Isn't she a librarian? She will be a manager. She will be a manager. She will be a designer. She will be a designer. She will be an engineer. She will be an engineer. She will be a photographer. She will be a photographer. She will be a journalist. She will be a journalist. She will be a dancer. She will be a dancer. She will be a programmer. She will be a programmer. She will be a counselor. She will be a counselor. She will be a psychologist. She will be a psychologist. She will be a translator. She will be a translator. She won't be a receptionist. She won't be a receptionist. She won't be a cashier. She won't be a cashier. She won't be a cleaner. She won't be a cleaner. She won't be a driver. She won't be a driver. She won't be a singer. She won't be a singer. She won't be a dancer. She won't be a dancer. She won't be a carpenter. She won't be a carpenter. She won't be a tailor. She won't be a tailor. She won't be a florist. She won't be a florist. She won't be a painter. She won't be a painter. Will she be a doctor? Will she be a doctor? Will she be a teacher? Will she be a teacher? Will she be a scientist? Will she be a scientist? Will she be an artist? Will she be an artist? Will she be a chef? Will she be a chef? Will she be a nurse? Will she be a nurse? Will she be a photographer? Will she be a photographer? Will she be a lawyer? Will she be a lawyer? Will she be a programmer? Will she be a programmer? Will she be a designer? Will she be a designer? Won't she be an engineer? Won't she be an engineer? Won't she be an artist? Won't she be an artist? Won't she be an actor? Won't she be an actor? Won't she be an architect? Won't she be an architect? Won't she be an accountant? Won't she be an accountant? Won't she be an author? Won't she be an author? Won't she be an entrepreneur? Won't she be an entrepreneur? Won't she be an engineer? Won't she be an engineer? Won't she be an economist? Won't she be an economist? Won't she be an educator? Won't she be an educator? She has been a teacher. She has been a teacher. She has been a nurse. She has been a nurse. She has been a lawyer. She has been a lawyer. She has been a doctor. She has been a doctor. She has been a chef. She has been a chef. She has been a manager. She has been a manager. She has been a designer. She has been a designer. She has been a singer. She has been a singer. She has been an artist. She has been an artist. She has been a writer. She has been a writer. She hasn't been a manager. She hasn't been a manager. She hasn't been a nurse. She hasn't been a nurse. She hasn't been a teacher. She hasn't been a teacher. She hasn't been a driver. She hasn't been a driver. She hasn't been a cleaner. She hasn't been a cleaner. She hasn't been a dancer. She hasn't been a dancer. She hasn't been a writer. She hasn't been a writer. She hasn't been a builder. She hasn't been a builder. She hasn't been a farmer. She hasn't been a farmer. She hasn't been a cook. She hasn't been a cook. Has she been a teacher? Has she been a teacher? Has she been a nurse? Has she been a nurse? Has she been a doctor? Has she been a doctor? Has she been a manager? Has she been a manager? Has she been a writer? Has she been a writer? Has she been a singer? Has she been a singer? Has she been a driver? Has she been a driver? Has she been a dancer? Has she been a dancer? Has she been a cook? Has she been a cook? Has she been a builder? Has she been a builder? Hasn't she been a coach? Hasn't she been a coach? Hasn't she been a chef? Hasn't she been a chef? Hasn't she been a consultant? Hasn't she been a consultant? Hasn't she been a farmer? Hasn't she been a farmer? Hasn't she been a driver? Hasn't she been a driver? Hasn't she been a mechanic? Hasn't she been a mechanic? Hasn't she been a photographer? Hasn't she been a photographer? Hasn't she been a nurse? Hasn't she been a nurse? Hasn't she been a scientist? Hasn't she been a scientist? Hasn't she been a stylist? Hasn't she been a stylist? She was a teacher. She was a teacher. She was a doctor. She was a doctor. She was a manager. She was a manager. She was a singer. She was a singer. She was a writer. She was a writer. She was a nurse. She was a nurse. She was a driver. She was a driver. She was a chef. She was a chef. She was a student. She was a student. She was a dancer. She was a dancer. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a manager. She wasn't a manager. She wasn't a singer. She wasn't a singer. She wasn't a writer. She wasn't a writer. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a driver. She wasn't a driver. She wasn't a chef. She wasn't a chef. She wasn't a student. She wasn't a student. She wasn't a dancer. She wasn't a dancer. Was she a teacher? Was she a teacher? Was she a doctor? Was she a doctor? Was she a manager? Was she a manager? Was she a singer? Was she a singer? Was she a writer? Was she a writer? Was she a nurse? Was she a nurse? Was she a driver? Was she a driver? Was she a chef? Was she a chef? Was she a student? Was she a student? Was she a dancer? Was she a dancer? Wasn't she a teacher? Wasn't she a teacher? Wasn't she a doctor? Wasn't she a doctor? Wasn't she a manager? Wasn't she a manager? Wasn't she a singer? Wasn't she a singer? Wasn't she a writer? Wasn't she a writer? Wasn't she a nurse? Wasn't she a nurse? Wasn't she a driver? Wasn't she a driver? Wasn't she a chef? Wasn't she a chef? Wasn't she a student? Wasn't she a student? Wasn't she a dancer? Wasn't she a dancer?